I want you to get out your study guide for the test that you're going to take tomorrow. We went over all of this together on Friday. If you were absent, you can pause the screencast right now and get these notes copied down. But this is what you need to know in order to understand how to identify sentence types. So we did the first one together. So we're going to do the next couple. And I want you to check your paper. If you didn't do it on your own yet, you can always pause the screencast and then rewatch it when you're ready to go. So number 2, I would first look for prepositional phrases, and I see in his office. I'm going to highlight that. So the first thing I'm going to rule out is a compound sentence. I know there's no compound because there's no comma and coordinating conjunction. My sentence says the light was way too bright. The next thing I'd look for is a complex sentence. And I would look in here to see if I see any of my subordinating conjunctions, which I do not. That means that this has to be simple. And if this is simple, I should have one main subject and one verb. Now I know that in his office isn't going to be the subject because it's a prep phrase. So light must be the subject and the light was is the verb. This sentence does not have a transition because there's nothing before the light with a comma. Mr. Kerr tugged on his sleeve and Kayla locked eyes on the inch-long patch of straight black lines on the underside of his wrist. So the first thing I'm going to do is look for prep phrases, and I see on his sleeve and on the 1-inch patch of straight black lines on the underside and of his left wrist. Got rid of most of that sentence there. So the next thing I'm going to look for is a comma conjunction, and I do see one. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's compound. This could have a list. So I'm going to look on the left side. Mr. Kerr tugged. The subject is the person, Mr. Kerr, and what did he do? He tugged. And on the other side, Kayla locked her eyes. Now let's say I'm not sure if the subject is Kayla or eyes. I could look for the verb first. What's the action? Something locked. What locked? Kayla locked her eyes. So this is a compound sentence. I found a subject and a verb on both sides of the comma conjunction. Number 4, when she turned 17, she would qualify for a barcode. So I see a prepositional phrase here for a barcode. And I'm left with when she turned 17, she would qualify. So the first thing I'm going to look for is compound. Do I see a comma conjunction? I do not. So it's not compound. I see a comma, but it's a comma she. So now I'm going to look for complex. Do I see a subordinating conjunction? And I know my WH words are subordinating conjunctions. So when she turned 17. If that's a dependent clause, there's got to be a subject. It's about she, and what did she do? She turned. So there's my dependent clause. That means this must be an independent clause. She is the subject again, and would qualify works together as the verb. So this sentence is complex. And again, this kind of work is what you need to be able to show me. It's not a guessing game. I don't want you just to write simple, compound, complex. On your test, I want to know how you know what the sentence type is. As soon as their birthdays came, most kids ran out to get theirs. And I see an infinitive to get, which means out isn't a preposition here. It's an adverb. Now I'd look for compound. I don't see a comma conjunction. I see a comma, but not with a conjunction. So now I'm going to look for complex. Do I see a subordinating conjunction? Now I know we talked about as, but as soon as long as, these kind of work together as one subordinating conjunction. As soon as their birthdays came. The verb here is came. What came? A lot of people want to put the possessive pronoun just because it's the first word in the sentence, but that's not the subject. That's actually describing the subject. Whose birthdays? Their birthdays. So birthdays is the subject and came is the verb. That's my dependent clause. So my independent clause is over here. Most kids ran out. Kids is the subject. Ran is the verb, so that's an independent clause. An independent clause with a dependent is complex. Number 6, even adults were getting them, and her parents had been tattooed for 7 months now. So I see a prepositional phrase for 7 months. Stop at the noun. Now I'm going to start by looking for a compound sentence. Do I see a comma and a conjunction? And I do. So now I'm going to see, is there a subject and a verb on both sides? Even adults were getting them. So I should look for the verb first. What's happening? Parents are getting. Who's getting? Adults are getting. And then on the other side, her parents had been tattooed. What's the subject? It's not her. Her shows ownership. It's describing her parents, and her parents, this whole thing works together as a verb, had been tattooed. Now I saw a lot of people trying to put a box around even. If even is doing, even with even if, even though, but even when it's by itself is just an adverb. So we're not going to worry about labeling it. But I can tell this is a compound sentence because there's a subject and a verb on both sides. If I thought this was a dependent clause, remember we can take dependent clauses out of the sentence. I would not have been able to take that out of the sentence because I would have started with and. So that's another way to know that even could not be a subordinating conjunction. So this is compound. She thought it was bizarre to be branded like a box of cereal. So I see to be branded as part of that verb, like a box of cereal. So I'm left with she thought it was bizarre. So first I'm going to look for compound. I don't see a comma conjunction. Now I'm going to look for complex. I don't see a subordinating conjunction. So let me see what the subject and verb is. Looks like she is the subject and she thought. But when I look at what's left, it was bizarre. That sounds like a sentence too. And so I'm thinking that I have one of these places where I can add the word that. That it was bizarre. It is the subject and was is the verb. So this is one of those understood that's. That makes this a complex sentence. Although she was only half listening, she understood what he meant. So look for phrases, and I don't see any. So I'm going to look to see if there's a comma conjunction. I see a comma, but it's a comma she, so that's not going to work. Now I'm going to look for a complex, and I recognize right away, although she was only half listening. She is the subject, was is the verb, or actually was listening works together. On the other side, I see another subordinating conjunction. I see what and what he meant. So I have two dependent clauses here and here. So my independent clause must be she understood. She is the subject, understood is the verb. So this is complex. Remember, there can be more than one dependent clause. It doesn't change the meaning or the type of sentence in any way. Number 9, I will never be accepted into an art college without a scholarship. So I see into an art college without a scholarship. And I'm left with I will never be accepted. Well, I can tell it's not compound. There's no comma conjunction. Now I'm going to look for complex. I will never be accepted. So I don't see one, and I don't see a place where I could add a that either. So let's see. I think the subject is I, and I will be accepted is my verb. So this is simple. No place to add a subordinating conjunction there. An eye scan proves your identity, but a barcode contains all your information. So of is a preposition, so of your information. Going to look to see if I have a compound sentence. Do I see a comma conjunction? And I do. So now I've got to see, is there a subject on both sides? An eye scan proves your identity. So the sentence isn't talking about an eye. It's talking about a scan. And what does the scan do? It proves. And then on this side, a barcode contains all. The subject is the barcode. And what does it do? It contains. So this is compound. Amber Thorne, who was Kayla's best friend, had just gotten her tattoo. I don't see any phrases in there, so I'm going to start with compound. I see a comma who and a comma had, but no coordinating conjunction. So now I'm going to look for a complex. And I see who. Who was Kayla's best friend? Was is the verb, and I can tell that my subordinating conjunction now acts like the subject because that's the only word that's left. So there's my dependent clause. So my independent clause is Amber Thorne had just gotten her tattoo. Amber is the subject of the independent clause, and Amber had just gotten is my verb. So this looks kind of like in a positive, but it can't be in a positive. There are commas here, but there's no noun in here that renames Amber. There's just a grouping of words that describes Amber, but it's a dependent clause, so this is complex. And I point this out because in number 12, this is a very, very similar sentence. Jean, a boy who lived two doors down from her house, was standing at the corner. So I see at the corner, from her house. There's no noun after down, so it's not a preposition here. So I'm going to look for compound. Again, I see a comma was, but no conjunction. So I'm going to look for a subordinating conjunction. And I see who again. Who lived 2 doors down from her house. And it looks a lot like the sentence above. Who lived. Now in this case, I do have a noun left. I have the noun a boy, which renames Jean. So in this case, this would have been in a positive. But my independent clause is left with Jean was standing. So Jean has to be the subject. Was standing has to be the verb. And that makes this complex. When they realized the ambulance was at her house, they broke into a run. So I see at her house and into a run. So I'm going to look first to see, is it compound? Do I see a comma conjunction? I see a comma, but it has they after it. So I know it's not compound. Now I'm going to look for complex. I'm going to look for my sentence. When is a subordinating conjunction? When what? When they realized. So they is the subject there, and realized is the verb. Oh, actually, when they realized the ambulance was at her house, it's that whole thing. That makes this the independent clause, and there's only 2 words left. So they must be the subject, and broke must be the verb. So this is a complex sentence. Her mother opened her mouth to answer, but she spotted her daughter and stopped. So I see an infinitive, to answer. Oops, I erased my comma there. So now I'm going to look for compound. Do I see a comma conjunction, comma, but? I do. So let's see if there's a subject and a verb on both sides. Her mother opened her mouth. The sentence is about her mother. And what did she do? She opened. On the other side, it says she spotted her daughter and stopped. Now, I do see another coordinating conjunction, but there's no comma with it. The subject here is she spotted and stopped. So there are 2 verbs here, but there's not a subject and a verb on that side. But on this comma but, we've got a subject and a verb and a subject and a verb. So this is compound. And the last one, the barcode did this to him. I see a prep phrase, to him. I'm going to rule out compound because I don't see a comma conjunction. I don't see a subordinating conjunction. So I'm left with the barcode did, which makes this simple. Now the last thing I want to do is find my transitions. So I'm going to go anywhere that I see at the beginning of a sentence where I had a clause or phrase. We had outside here. Here I have a dependent clause up to the comma. Here's a dependent clause up to the comma. Another dependent clause up to the comma. And one more. Now, if any of these prepositional phrases was at the beginning, they too would have been transitions. So this is to study for your test tomorrow. I will be collecting this paper to see that it's done, but make sure you study.